and after. So we're going to start because we want a lot of time for Q&A. Let's see, we have some Zoom guests today. Welcome. And we are excited to have been able to reschedule this. This is a COVID reschedule and get to do it in person instead of Zoom. So that's the treat of importing Ron in person. Okay, so I'm just so pleased to introduce Ronald Dahl. Many of you here have heard of him because he is a bridger. He's the middle of the Venn diagram. He intersects so many different areas. So I first heard about his work as a graduate student studying HPA axis, stress, neuroendocrinology, mental health. So that's where I thought he landed. But actually, he has one hat as a sleep researcher and neurobiology of sleep and the developing brain, and it was huge in that area. So that was, Ron Dahl of, just a pioneer in this area. And then he got recruited. He was an endowed professor at Pittsburgh in psychiatry, and just a major force in the field, a huge mentor. And then somehow we got so lucky that he got recruited to our Bay Area by Berkeley and was heading that joint medical program for a while and has now founded the Center for the Developing Adolescent. And I would say that he's, I actually got to hear him at Davos, and he's been invited several years to speak at the World Economic Forum. And that's when I realized, this type of work he does is just in another league. It's just at another level. And there are very few people who do this type of global, intervention / policy work on mental health in youth. So I was quite blown away, and we've all been excited to hear him talk about some of his work, his views, his initiatives, and just the breadth of his work is pretty amazing. You'll have a copy of the CV, and the emerging theme, which I think we'll probably see today, is how the adolescent is developing in the digital world in this new mental health context. And then there's also a formal bio, which I will just give you a few lines from. He's the director of the Institute for Human Development at UC Berkeley, and he is examining both vulnerabilities and opportunities being created by the rapid changes in how information technology is affecting learning and development. And we're excited to open the door to a bridge between UCSF and Berkeley through Ron and his amazing work and mentorship. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Looks like we lost our screen. I'm not sure why. Let me see if that fixes it. I hope. I don't know. It was up there. There we go. So what I want to share most of all is a strong belief that we as a community of researchers, clinicians, and people who care about our young people can do a better job promoting behavioral, emotional, and mental health of young people. And that we can, in particular, do that by linking scientific advances relevant to having that impact. It was an interesting article a few months ago. Mitch Prinstein and Kathleen Athier published this paper in June saying science shows how to protect kids' mental health, but it's being ignored. There has been a lot of attention, and from everything from, Surgeon General, American Academy of Pediatrics, American Psychological Association, many other CDC, about the mental health crisis in young people. And there's controversy about to what degree it is a mental health crisis and the magnitude. But I think there's a lot of basis for the concerns and the overwhelming level of demand and need that's happening. And with putting aside some of the controversies, I think there are a few parts that are quite clear. One is that there's very high rates of self-reported emotional and psychological distress, self-harm, suicide, and depression. And some of the increases started before the pandemic, clearly amplified by the pandemic. And importantly, there's no single youth serving system alone that can address this growing set of behavioral, emotional, and mental health problems and the social aspects of that. The healthcare system alone, psychological services, psychiatric services, social welfare, education, public health, and policymakers. And it's also important, from my perspective, that we recognize this is a global issue. Okay, we have the largest number of adolescents that have ever existed and the highest proportion of the world population that's ever been adolescents. Of the 1.2 billion adolescents who are going to come of age in the next 10 years, 90% of them are growing up in low and middle income countries in the world. In India alone, there's 250 million adolescents between 10 and 19 who are going to be coming of age in the next 10 years. Sub-Saharan Africa has the largest number and proportion of young people. The dark blue is where the mean age is. We're doing a better job helping infants survive. There's been a lot of progress in health the first 3 years of life. And this is creating this bulge of, and contraception has actually been more effective, but there's been this bulge of young people. And it's important to remember, in addition to what we're seeing in the United States and in other wealthy parts of the world, that youth are coming of age amidst unprecedented global challenges and changes, including the role of digital technology in their daily lives in ways that are creating opportunities and vulnerabilities. I'm going to come back to that. So the question is, where's the evidence base? Where's the science that can inform how to think about the magnitude of these issues? I won't even put an estimate on the number or the percentages of young people who are struggling in these ways. I want to flip it the other way, which is the degree to which this generation of young people thrive and become effective leaders and citizens, and dealing with the global challenges is just as important. How can science, how can our evidence base contribute to the magnitude of these problems? And honestly, we can't wait for studies, longitudinal studies in 10 or 20 years to tell us what we should have done in 2022, because the world will look very different in 2032. And so we need science, we need evidence base, and we can't really wait for basic science and translational science to give the kind of clear-cut answers we want. And so what I want to do today is I'm going to walk you through not what I think is the answer, but I think it's one piece of an approach that I think is compelling, and I hope that it actually can be a model for other pieces of the puzzle. So what I'm going to do, I don't have a pointer, I'm going to just use my hand. So I'm going to cover these 6 boxes. I'm going to start out talking about developmental science perspective and what I mean by that, and particularly developmental science of adolescence and how it's creating both vulnerabilities and opportunities. I'm going to zoom in on this period roughly 10 to 14 as the transition from childhood into adolescence as a particularly important window of opportunity for positive impact. I'm going to step back out and have us think about what is adolescence. I'm going to talk about that from an evolutionary perspective and from a demography perspective in modern life, and so how that's a part of the perspective. And then we're going to zoom back into some more basic questions about hormones, pubertal hormones, not as hormonal effects, I'm going to unpack that, but really how part of the evolution of adolescence and this window of development is about a period of learning and adaptivity. And if we understand this window in those terms, I think that creates new opportunities. And then finally, within that learning sphere that is amplified or potentiated by this window of development, what's particularly important is learning in the sphere of social relationships, social identity, social value, a feeling of mattering, and the inherent importance of that in this period of development. And it is those insights that lead us to strategies for promoting healthy development in targeted ways in this window of time relevant to mental health. Each one of those boxes could be an hour talk. I'm going to spend 5 minutes on each box, so we're going to go a little fast. What do we mean by integrative developmental science? So it's clearly based, the foundation is basic science, basic developmental neuroscience, genetics, science of learning, but it is those areas of advance integrated with developmental psychology, education, and population perspectives, and thinking about social, clinical, and implementation sciences. It's thinking about developmental processes and developmental trajectories and inflection points when those can be modified. The top two little graphs are the classic growth velocity curves that pediatricians use. It goes from birth to age 18. You can see that in the first couple years of life, kids are growing incredibly fast. They slow down their rate of growth. They're still growing, but the rate slows down. And then suddenly, about age 12 in boys and around 10 in girls, you see this sharp increase. Then it comes down. That's the pubertal growth spurt. Okay, if you are surviving a famine, a war, incredible stress, and you happen to be in a period of rapid growth, you're going to have stunted growth. You're going to have depletion of your bone mass. It's going to affect your muscles. It's thinking about those developmental processes, and it's not being an age. It's a developmental process that's creating opportunities for positive impact and vulnerabilities. And this is not about physical growth. This is about thinking about more complex developmental processes in the same way. The developmental science of adolescence is thinking about how the onset of puberty begins this perfect storm of interacting levels of change. Of course, rapid physical growth is part of this, but it's also the activation of new drives and motivations, sex-specific changes in your face, your voice changes, your body's changing, changes in sleep and circadian regulation, metabolic changes as you're growing twice as fast, a wide array of cognitive and emotional changes, changes in gene expression, and profound changes in social motivations, social contexts, and taking on social roles in complex ways. The point is that at every level, there are changes, and at every cross to another level, there are bidirectional interactions. And if I put all the bidirectional arrows in there, you wouldn't be able to read the words. It is this multiple levels of interaction that creates cascading changes that primarily have been studied in terms of vulnerabilities. Oh, and then of course, figuring out how to relate to the world and yourself as a suddenly and mystifyingly sexual being. There's so many aspects of identity that become more salient in adolescence. Now, most of the studies that drove these advances in the last 30 years have been because of the health consequences, negative. It's what I call the dark side of the spiraling interactions, the health paradox of adolescence. Almost everything you can measure from childhood to the end of adolescence gets better. Strength, speed, reaction time, resilience, immune function, cognitive ability, self-control, resilience to injury. And yet what happens to morbidity and mortality? It goes up 200 to 300% between ages 8 and ages 18 to 25. And of course, these aren't medical problems. They're problems with behavior and emotion. It's accidents, suicide, homicide, depression, alcohol and substance use, sexually transmitted diseases, worsening obesity. We can go on and on. We know that where the morbidity and mortality is coming from. Now, the next slide is a slide. It's an old slide, but it is one that it was a moment for me. I was involved in some research looking at health impact. I mean, this was a time when smoking was the single largest preventable cause of health problems. But what this shows is that all of the health problems, from lung cancer, from emphysema, from hypertension, from chronic high blood pressure, all of the problems out in 40, 60, 70, 80 years of age have one onset. Almost everyone who has those health problems across the lifespan started smoking between 10 and 18. But I could now show you 25 slides. We'll take one more, the classic age crime curve. This is from 2015. What you can see is that if you're looking at rates of murder, rape, robbery, these are problems from about 18 to 25, and they drop way off. But if you're focused on the rate of problems, you think of 18 to 25-year-olds. If you're a developmental scientist, aren't you more interested in what's happening between 10 and 15? Drug use and dependence. Looking at where the rates peak leads you to one focus. Looking at where they start, like smoking, it's between 10 and 15. I'm going to do the 5-minute version, so I'll just show you one more. Self-injurious injury. Okay, if you're thinking of staffing or addressing the problem and treating it, you're looking at 10 to 25-year-olds. But if you're a developmental scientist, what's happening between 10 and 13? Okay, we're changing axis. This is no longer age at the bottom. This is some data from England looking at the secular trend of self-harm. And I'm showing this because it's not just being an age. If we're thinking about developmental processes, the increase is completely in girls. We know the data from depression, okay? And this is from Shelley Avenalli's paper in 2015. We've known for a long time that rates of depression go up in adolescence. We know that it tends to change in the sex ratio to 2 to 3 times more frequent in females during adolescence. And of course, the rates in transgender and non-binary youth are also very high. It's not just biological sex, but these are pointing to processes. And it's not just risk factors. It's not just, how do they give us insight how to treat these problems? How do we think about the developmental processes and intervening early in these processes that can maybe have a bigger impact? Which brings me to the second box. And that is that this window, I'm going to say 10 to 14, but as we'll unpack, it's not about being an age. It's about a set of developmental processes. They are an inflection point. They're an inflection point not only to several other areas of negative trajectories for behavioral, emotional, and social health, but they're also a formative period for the development of many types of habits, preferences, patterns of behavior, mindsets, and aspects of social identity in ways that have long-term impact on not only health, but academic success, economic success, and social competence. And thinking about understanding these processes and how to modify them in positive ways is not simply preventing specific disorders. It's about promoting positive development and using the best science, integrative developmental science, to inform and to do experiments to test features of those models. Now, I think that a lot of the exciting work in the last 10 years has been moving away from a vulnerability model to recognizing that everything about these cascading multiple levels of interaction are just as true for positive trajectories. Early adolescence is a perfect storm of opportunities. It's time of learning, exploration, acquiring knowledge and skills, identity formation, especially social identity, shaping intrinsic motivations and values, individually shaped heartfelt goals and priorities. And the transdisciplinary developmental science to inform how to leverage these insights to improve trajectories is relatively early, but it's at a really exciting point. And I want to talk about this a little bit and take a few pieces of this. This is from a paper we published in Nature in 2018. Nature did a whole set of publications on the science of adolescence that is as an emerging science. This was the lead article for that series. And we were, in essence, making a case for investing in adolescence, and particularly early adolescence globally, because of the return by having these positive effects and focusing on the emerging evidence for the neurobehavioral changes that are happening with puberty starting this multi-level dynamic changes. And of course, part of this is the increased motivational salience of the social dynamics, the relationships, the peers, the sexual and romantic interests, status and prestige. There's a lot of complex social learning that's highly emotional happening in these periods of time. And it's part of also the well-recognized increase in sensation seeking and novelty seeking, individual differences, but clearly there's also this is part of the pubertal maturation and changes in social information processing. I'm going to come back to what I mean by changes in social information processing in a few minutes. But a key part of this is increased sensitivity to social value feedback, both positive feedback and negative feedback. Everybody probably remembers something that happened in maybe middle school or 11, 12, 13, you made a little social mistake or did something embarrassing, and it is still burned in your head as a humiliation moment that you cringe every time you remember. And I would wager most of us remember sometime in that window of time, early to mid-adolescence, the first time an adult took us seriously. That was your idea? You created that? You wrote this? The thrill of the positive social value feedback. And these examples fit with a lot of data about the sensitivity and the emotional intensity of both positive and negative social value feedback. It's part of, if you talk to middle school teachers, it's so emotionally noisy, it's so socially noisy, but those are learning signals. Those are powerful learning signals that direct someone to find ways to gain social value, to contribute, to not only feel belonging and acceptance and respect, but finding niches for contribution. And there's a really fascinating set of issues in this that we're going to come back to. There's also changes in sleep and circadian regulation, and increasingly in the science of learning, there are subtle changes in reinforcement learning, in trial and error learning. And so much of this learning is not taking in social information and watching people, it's trying things. Figuring out how to trust people, how to interact with people, how to express interest in them, to respond to them not seeming interested in you. This is trial and error learning. And the reinforcement learning models for adolescents are suggesting there are changes in those processes that favor adapting to rapidly changing volatile predictability in social situations, which is quite adaptive, but it's also noisy. So let's just take a step back. We're at the third box. What is adolescence? Okay, so it begins with these early biological changes that are part of puberty, with hormones in the brain stimulating other hormones in the body, which then go back to the brain. And clearly, kids are no longer a child as they begin to have these transformational changes in their bodies and brains. But there is no biological end of adolescence. The end of adolescence is in the social domain. It's taking on adult roles, responsibilities, and having the knowledge, skills, and capacities to be competent and independent. And it's important to recognize that it is a myth that this is an invention of industrial society or recent society. This is the cover of a book Alice Schlegel and Herb Berry wrote, I think in 1990. They had looked at 187 different pre-industrial and hunter-gatherer societies, and every one of them, virtually every one where they could get enough data to even evaluate, recognized a period that was no longer childhood. There was some initiation, right? They were not children, but they were not yet fully adult. But interestingly, it was on average a short period of time, about 2 to 4 years. Now, that interval is about 8 to 15 years. And this is an interesting part of what adolescence is about now. Okay? It continues to be the case. If you look, this again, it's an old study, but it's still, if you look in hunter-gatherer society, there's a handful of that still exists. This was a study of a hunter-gatherer society of Papua New Guinea and another high-altitude Nepal. The average age of menarche was 18 to 18.6 years, and the average age of first birth was in the early 20s. Okay? That was probably true throughout most of human history. Now, this is a figure, I remember, this was a figure in Michael Rudder's book in 1989. He was calling attention to this as he was thinking about developmental psychopathology. The fact that the average age of menarche had dropped from about 15 to 16 in 1860 to 1960 down to below 13. And this was clearly a transformational change in adolescence itself. Carol Worthman's an anthropologist who studied adolescence all over the world. She has one of the articles in that Nature series. and I use this quote a lot. And I remember when we were first talking about this, she said the past 150 years have witnessed a quiet revolution that's still in human development that still sweeps across the globe today. Children nearly everywhere are growing faster, reaching reproductive and physical maturity at earlier ages, and larger adult sizes than perhaps ever in the history of Homo sapiens. So adolescence has expanded. Okay? This is a figure from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine report on the science of adolescence that came out a few years ago. And in this, they defined, with the groups of people that were worked on this, the decision was to define adolescence as 10 to 25. But of course, how do you characterize a window that goes from 10 to 25? They are so different. And of course, some of the changes, adrenarche, some of these adrenal androgens start going up by age 6 or 7, but they don't peak until the mid-20s. Gonadarche, the beginning of the changes of physical puberty, are starting often by 8 to 10, and the average age of menarche is now between 12 and 13. Tremendous individual differences. But this represents a set of changes across a long window of time. And what I want to talk about when I'm interested in adolescence broadly, and there's many different transitions of interest, but I want us to focus mostly today on this blue and bluish green area, this early adolescent period, the transition from childhood into adolescence. Now, I do want to stop for a moment and say that just the expansion of adolescence raises some compelling questions. Is this an expansion of a period of learning and plasticity? Does it close off earlier childhood plasticity at an earlier time? Does this create more years for young people to learn and adapt and figure out who they are? Or does it create an increased period of vulnerability to have those negative spirals take off and create more problems? And I think one of the interesting areas of evidence is that it's doing both. And that's why it's amplifying inequalities. So for kids who are in the most advantaged environments with lots of opportunities and scaffolding to try out who they are and learn new skills and figure out which things really resonate with them, and they have support if they fall down to get back up, that may give them more time to acquire the skills and capacities that will help them be successful. But for the kids who are in the highest risk environments and the least number of opportunities to have those positive learning experiences and the most exposure to some of the risk factors, it may increase the number of times they may start these negative spirals. There's also, again, this is a whole long, complicated set of ideas about accelerated aging and some of the factors that have contributed not only to earlier puberty, but some changes in aging. But the part of this that has fascinated our group and some of my colleagues and researchers, what's happened to brain development given all of these changes? And the short story is, it really looks like some aspects of brain development are accelerated as puberty is accelerated, and others are not. And that's been a focus of some of our work for a long time. This is a figure from a paper, just 10 years ago. Evelyn Krohn and I wrote a paper that was in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, summarizing the data. We did some meta-analyses of thinking in more modular ways about the brain and separating puberty from non-pubertal influences on development. And then putting it back together in the discussion of this paper. And what we've said, and it's still part of the heuristic model in my brain, is that what's happening as puberty kicks in, sometimes very early and certainly earlier than throughout most of human history, is primarily influencing not just certain brain structures. It's not about brain structures. I don't know why that jumped. Sorry, go back. Whoops. But also the circuits. What's happening as you change social and emotional information processing and greater salience to certain kinds of social learning, these circuits are interacting with all the prefrontal cortical processing and goals and connecting strong feelings with these goals. And so it's shifting the way these systems are interacting to an earlier time. And this is why this idea that you increase the risk for the negative growth trajectories from the risks, but you also create new opportunities over this longer window of time. And there's a lot to unpack here, and there's been a lot of research since 2012. But I want to take one more big picture framework, the fourth block, and that's the evolutionary perspective and how the hormone-specific shifts in some of the information processing and learning may give us some insights, some additional insights. So Adolescence is a period after juvenility, after a juvenile period. Many species have juvenile periods. There's incredible richness to understanding evolution and development, Evo-Devo interactions. And part of evolution is creating developmental windows for learning and adaptation. And insects have metamorphosis, and amphibians have metamorphosis, and those are actually driven by hormones, similar hormones to what happened at puberty. But in mammals, there's usually a juvenile period, but in a subset of species, there's an extra period of adolescence after puberty. And I think for some time, people thought that was a pretty strange thing for humans. But I've been involved in some collaborations for the last few years with some colleagues who have done some amazing work. Rachna Reddy and has spent 11 years studying the adolescent period of development in longitudinal studies and in go-go in chimpanzees, and she's done work in bonobos. Aaron Sandell had done some of the work prior to when Rachna took over those studies. And again, this is a paper that's still in review, actually it's in revision in developmental cognitive neuroscience, looking at a remarkable and interesting set of processes. They have an infant period that's quite long. There's about 5 years of spacing between birth. Up to 5 years, the infant, even though they're physically developed, stays with the mother almost complete all the time. Then when the new baby is born, that starts the juvenile period from 5 to 8, where they start exploring more. Pubertal hormones begin to change at about age 8, and early adolescence is really 8 to 12 in chimpanzees and goes on for about 3 years. But then there is this longer period of late adolescence and young adulthood where the individuals are still not fully adult. They don't get pant grunts from the other chimpanzees. They're not treated as adults. And the question this has been raising for a lot of people this had not been studied in wild chimpanzees. Chimpanzees, by the way, in the wild live to about 70 years of age. So they have long lifespans, and they have an incredibly elongated period of adolescence that people had not recognized until it was really studied. And the question is, what are those post-juveniles doing for all those years after puberty? How did evolution for both bonobos and chimpanzees create this long period? And it turns out they are learning. They are learning socially. They are learning how to touch, how to vocalize, how to interact, to develop relationships in nuanced, complicated ways, and to study and understand the power dynamics in their group. And it is an elaborate and complicated period in order to be successful. And it's raised all kinds of interesting questions about why this has been so prolonged. Why does it take so long to learn? But interestingly, there's another twist that wasn't recognized. And that is that in contrast to most non-human primates and many mammals, at puberty, in many of the non-human primates, it's the males that leave. They leave the primary troop and go out and have to find new troops, so there's not inbreeding. But in bonobos and chimpanzees, it's the females that leave. The males stay in their kin group throughout their life with their mothers, with their siblings and cousins, and have siblings for their entire life. The females leave, and no one knows why. They don't get forced out. And the thing to appreciate is this is an incredibly dangerous thing to do. These are rival groups. Chimpanzee wars are unbelievably ugly. I mean, I don't know how much you know about, these are species that are really, the intergroup violence is really, really high. And they have border patrols around the territory where they fight and really terrible things happen. Well, what happens is a female will go out, stay near the border patrol, and then just leave and go in the enemy group, leaving every individual they know, all the feeding sites they know, all the social support they have, and go into a new troop. That is an incredibly dangerous, risky, irrational thing to do. And yet, it is part of bonobo and chimpanzees. that females have to start completely new, and the first relationships they form in the new troop, and these cannot be studied because you can't follow them in the new troop, they can only see the females that come in from other groups. And the relationships they form will determine where their offspring will be able to feed 20 years later. The stakes are really high. And so the learning among the males and among the females is incredibly high stakes. So why do I say that's part of the framework? Is I think that it leads us to understand a new approach to what we should be thinking about. And I'm going to just give one quick study on pubertal hormones. There's many, many different studies. There's imaging studies. It's a very complicated story. And obviously, it's not just testosterone and estradiol and progesterone and oxytocin. There's a lot of different hormones. I'm just going to give you a piece of the puzzle for this study. This is a study that double-blind, placebo-controlled, giving testosterone in a social interaction called an ultimatum game, where people can offer money fairly or unfairly, and then the other person gets to respond. And the short version of this is that when it's blind, when your testosterone has been raised, you are clearly more likely to respond aggressively to an unfair provocation of somebody doing a very unfair division when it was their turn. But when they were generous, if you're in the testosterone condition, you're more likely to give a much more generous response. And in more sophisticated versions of this, it's really, if you can gain prestige by being kind and generous, the testosterone makes you more likely to do that. And testosterone goes up in girls earlier than it goes up in boys. I mean, both hormones are relevant in both biological sexes. And it's led to thinking about not aggression and status, but how we earn prestige and how this potentiates not behavior, but there's a whole other way to think about this. Rather than the effects of hormones on behavior, we should be asking, what are the effects of these hormones on learning, on social information processing? What's salience? What activates salience network processing? What are the effects on social trial and error learning and effects on social motivation? And I think that begins to give us insight into the potential of this window as these effects are beginning to kick in. Now I'm going to go on one last little tangent here. The question is this normal or pathologic adolescent behavior? Okay. First time meeting in real life, pre-pandemic, romantic feelings are taking off really fast. Okay. Amidst the festivities, this grand party, this teenage boy notices a girl he finds strikingly attractive, smitten, he approaches her, flirts a bit, she really finds him attractive. But interestingly, by the time he leaves the party, with a kiss followed by a second kiss, these two have exchanged less than 100 words and are swooning with being intensely in love, okay? And they are obsessed. They cannot stop thinking about each other, okay? And with that kind of obsession and longing, of course, they manage to get together again. And then after the second clandestine rendezvous, passions really take off. And within a few days, every motivational priority has been displaced. They'll give up food, sleep, any competing reward. Nothing can get close to the desire to be together. And within a few more days, it's as if the entire universe had always intended for those two people to be together, and they will spurn family and friends, and that life itself is not worth living without each other, even though they just met 2 weeks earlier and barely know each other. Okay, is that pathologic? Simply ridiculous? That's the most successful tragedy in Western literature. And it was written centuries before Shakespeare dramatized it. And it continues. I mean, Steven Spielberg just did another version of the West Side Story version of this story. How can this resonate as a tragedy when it's so ridiculous? Because we recognize not just that it makes people do crazy behavior, but it's the speed and intensity with which their motivations can get hijacked completely. And it makes us think about the affective dimension of motivation, the intensity of feelings, the best feelings someone's ever had in their life, and the worst feelings they've ever had in their life are often activated in those early stages of falling in love. The power of those feelings are shaping motivation. And I have a colleague who often says in an understated way that motivation often precedes learning. And I just want to emphasize it's often the feelings of motivation, not just what you make yourself do top down. And the understanding the activation of some of these feelings, and again, it's interesting, a lot of emotion researchers, thinking about these emotion and affective dynamics and how they change in adolescence is part of the learning window that's happening. So let's get back to the developing adolescent brains. And what's been fascinating is to think, as the model has progressed over the last 10 years, that rather than think about an adolescent deficient brain, that it's not up to par with an adult brain, it's to appreciate that adolescent brains are incredibly well adapted to the challenges and tasks of adolescence, learning about who to be, how to navigate complex social situations that are highly unpredictable and uncertain and novel, and to do it in ways to gain social value and not lose social value. And this is shaping deep motivations, what you care about, what your priorities are, heartfelt goals. It's not just the capacity to fall in love with a particular person. You can fall in love with an idea, with an ideal, with a purpose, with meaning. And while these rapid learning experiences are happening, what's happening in the brain? This was a really influential paper to me. It came out now about 5 years ago, because as we've been moving from thinking about brain structures to thinking about connectome and circuits, and we learned that adults have individually highly specific connectomes, literally where our highways and superhighways and rapid semi-automatic processing streams are occurring through experience. But what's interesting is how late those individual differences emerge. And so in this Kaufman study, this is just the normal controls of the study. If you look at the quantification of distinctiveness, how distinct two individuals' connectomes, functional connectivity looks, what you see, if I had a pointer, and this goes from about age 9 to age 20, is that the black line shows us that it's less than 25% distinct. They really look highly similar. And then boom, it takes off and it goes more than 50% is distinct by the time you're 16. And the orange is females, and they start about a year and a half earlier than the boys, which would suggest something is suddenly making these distinct differences, individual differences in literally the connectome. And of course, there's been a lot of studies since. I'm just going to pick a few, much more sophisticated ways of quantifying. The Dong et al. In PNAS, they found that these shifting gradients of macroscale cortical organization that mark the transition from childhood to adolescence show an inflection point ages 11 to 14, as the principal gradient is moving from a childhood-like unimodal to an adult spatial framework. The Shaw et al. 2022, again, they found early adolescence is a critical stage in the functional connectome that children are undergoing this change, and in particularly 9 to 11, they're seeing this pivotal change toward an adult pattern. And interesting, in the Garcia Turbuenca in Neuroimage last year, they measured puberty. And what did they find? That the longitudinal sample showed that development of this functional connectome distinctiveness matched better to pubertal status than age. So this is a lot of emerging evidence that these patterns of connection that are probably contributing to our faster, more automatic patterns, not just of how we think and how we take information, but our behavioral proclivities. The reason we have the word color Stroop is we've read hundreds of thousands of words and only named 10,000 colors. You get interference. It's harder to name the color. There's thousands of examples of processes that are competing. And when you worry and ruminate 10,000 times and 100,000 times, you begin to create faster circuits. So much of this individual difference in our very connectome are being shaped in it's a pivotal time in early adolescence. So, box 5, is getting back to what's the essence of the kinds of learning that really seem to be potentiated. And we've been, there's a group of us, we've been really interested in this. It's not about the term mattering, but we've been trying to think about how to capture this set of social value learning changes and the feeling-based component of this. And one of the things that we've been very interested in is that part of what becomes even stronger in adolescence is just a basic desire to feel like we matter. What makes us feel like we matter? I mean, we can feel like we matter to our families, to our friends, to our communities, to our tribe, to our village, to the world. We can feel like we matter only if we get the highest grade, if we are YouTube stars, if we have enough likes. This desire to feel like we matter and the aversiveness of feeling like we don't matter or be disrespected, put down, excluded, not belonging. These are powerful aspects of what young people have. It's motivationally salient to matter. But there are a lot of ways to matter. There are many ways to gain prestige and feelings that one matter. Just being told in words that you matter may have very little effect if it doesn't feel authentic. And if you have some indications that indicate in subtle ways that you don't matter. And the experiences that shape these, I think, create some really interesting opportunities and vulnerabilities. So this integrative developmental model of pubertal changes in learning motivation is really about that it's a time of increased attention and set of salience for gaining and losing admiration, motivation to gain and maintain social value. The exploration of novel, ambiguous, and uncertain contexts promotes a lot of risk-taking, but a lot of that it's pro-social risk-taking. And it's shaped powerfully by culture and social norms and social values and TikTok stars and many and advertisers and marketing and famous people like Jay-Z and other examples. What is shaping the prestige criteria for young people that sensitize them to what is the way to earn prestige? And I have this picture of the Dalai Lama because, as a story I told earlier, is I remember when we were talking about this with a group of Tibetan Buddhist education experts, and they kind of laughed and they said, yeah, when the kids are in this age, they compete like crazy to show that they're more kind and more empathic than the other kids. And everybody laughs and they go, yeah, but you know what? Then you're practicing being kind and empathic in that period when your connectome's becoming distinct. So how do we leverage these insights? How do we bring this back to where we began? And I think there's a couple, I'm gonna go quickly. I know we're gonna run out of time and I wanna have some time for discussion, so I'm gonna go quickly over this. But I think that it's important to think about matching interventions, including learning opportunities and social support and ways to matter, to windows of sensitive learning. And there are really interesting ways to do that. It's not about early adolescence. It's what are the things to match in the first 3 years of life, for school starting transition, for transition to adulthood. But we have a lot of emerging hints about what's extra important in early adolescence. This could be a really formative time for pro-social learning and identity development. It's a really interesting time to find healthy ways to matter by doing things that matter to other people in a virtuous spiral. And it's a time that we may be able to shape mindsets in a broad way, not just what we believe, whether we have a growth mindset and we believe we can change, but a whole set of behaviors and proclivities that, that can be shaped as our connectome is being shaped, not only to how we interpret and believe and talk about ourselves, but how we have proclivities to behave. And I think that the last part of this, and it's been the center of a lot of our work of the last 5 years, is that the context where young people are doing this social trial and error learning is increasingly in the digital space, in the virtual space, online. And the pandemic accelerated that tremendously. They don't even call it interacting online. They're just talking to their friends. They're texting, they're interacting in the 20 ways. And this creates yet another level of opportunities and vulnerabilities because, and we'll just zoom in now on a pragmatic clinical one. There's huge controversy about the harm of digital tech Most of it's been exaggerated by the best meta-analyses and most rigorous research suggests that the effects are modest and may be particularly for vulnerable individuals. There's two strong signals there, though. Sleep problems are clearly amplified by, and they happen often in early adolescence. And social comparison feedback. I'm gonna just give you two quick examples. This was a study, I really like this study, Ron Rapay's group. Really, I'm just going to skip over. I'm going to tell you, it's really rigorously done, longitudinal, structured clinical interviews, looking at anxiety and controlling for all the things you would want to. And what they found is that what predicted increase in social anxiety was related to pubertal development and this appearance comparison experience online. Posting and getting likes, it's like, I think some person, it's like, it is so appealing. It's like catnip, like getting likes when you're an early adolescent, and then not getting them is so painful. And this happening as puberty is happening was predicting increase in anxiety and a decrease in positive social interactions. This is the first part, the main thing I want to say in terms of an example. In some work we've been doing for 15 or 20 years that started my work in Pittsburgh, is that clearly developing sleep problems and having fragmented, insufficient sleep, erratic sleep is a transdiagnostic risk factor for a whole set of issues. For kids, worry and rumination at bedtime is one of the most important factors in their sleep eroding, and they can keep themselves distracted all day doing things, but then when they try to go to bed, either they're still on their device, they're still interacting, they're FOMO, whether their friends are interacting and they're not part of it. And so this has become a key step in a whole cascade. And we did a lot of work to develop a savoring intervention to help, because you can't push worry and rumination away. And at the same time, there's other evidence, like the studies that Katie and Susan Hoeksema did, showing that rumination is a transdiagnostic factor in depression and anxiety, and that rumination may be a part of the mechanism from early adversity to problems. And so you start to see this set of processes around worry, rumination, negative thinking about the future and yourself, and worry and negative, and it's very difficult to break that. Even kids who are going through CBT for anxiety, if you don't address that bedtime rumination. We found, and this is Dana McMakin's work and others, you've got to replace, you can't just be mindful for 20 minutes and not have the intrusion of these ruminations. Actively savoring memories, there's a whole savoring intervention that Dana helped develop that we did at Pittsburgh. This is a way to flip the perspective from preventing anxiety and preventing rumination to promoting resilience factor, promoting savoring capacity, doing it at an early period of early adolescence, helping them develop those skills before the connectome is distinct, could really be a window of opportunity. This is just one specific example. I could give you 3 or 4 others where we're thinking about pathways to sets of disorders, thinking more transdiagnostically, not only about risk factors, but resilience factors that can be modified with interventions, and that technology can be scaffolding. You can swipe moments during the day to be savored later. That draws attention to those positive, uplifting moments. Finding time to practice reviewing them, helping support each other in doing that. Now you've developed the skill doing it at bedtime. If you stay in your savoring channel, you can keep your phone for 10 more minutes and then stop and just keep savoring. So these are approaches that are very practical, and they're going to be helping sleep, helping positive emotion and uplifting moments, recognition, and doing it at a window. This can become a mindset of sorts. So finally, I think this is just the tip of the iceberg for moving into a different framework, not just doing more longitudinal studies to figure out what we should do to intervene, but trying positive interventions by matching these opportunities to these windows and evaluating them, and using A/B designs and evaluating them, not by waiting for a 5-year RCT, but really in using more modern approaches to evaluate what's working and what makes it work better. And I think we really need more of this approach because this is happening fast. This is now almost 10 years old that UNICEF said, of the 7.5 billion people, 6 billion have access to mobile phones and 5 billion have access to working toilets. In sub-Saharan Africa, everyone has more than 95% cell phones. This is creating that perfect storm of vulnerability, 1.5 billion youth globally, risks of exploitation, social inequities, economic difficulties. But yet, this is also youth as early adopters, this entrepreneurial, the desire to matter and earn prestige by having a positive impact. And so thinking about how to promote this approach to helping the virtuous spiral of gaining prestige and getting feelings of mattering by contributing has enormous possibilities. Because again, these are truly gnarly, high stakes, real world problems. And there are truly compelling real world challenges. To engage youth as part of the solution and have feedback loops that they create feelings of mattering by doing things that really, really matter could really have a huge impact. Thank you very much. Steve.
So I'm reminded of a study that's over 40 years old that has clinical implications and implications for everything we're talking about. And this was a randomized controlled trial of stimulants like Ritalin to chimps and bonobo. And everybody knows that stimulants decrease impulsive aggression and negative compliance, except that there was a huge moderator effect of the social status of the age in question. If you were high on the hierarchy, stimulants made you much more effective with bullying and being aggressive. If you were lower in the hierarchy, stimulants were really good at making you more cautious and less impulsive and less aggressive. It's all about the context.
Right? Yeah.
You think about that clinically, and the stimulant is not a hormone per se, but the contextual nature and the developmental nature of everything you're talking about are lessons for all of us.
Yeah. Well, just one quick comment about that, and again, just to be clear, even though the between group aggression is so high, one of the things that comes out from people who, Rachna has spent big chunks of the year for 11 years following these, is that the way to get to the top of the hierarchy in chimpanzees isn't being a bully. It's developing trust and friendships, male-female friendship. People have not appreciated how nuanced and sophisticated social success is in chimps. And I think that's why it takes so many years. The bullying approach, there's some examples, but as part of it is it may have been whatever helps them develop those social skills. There was an orphaned male chimp who has risen incredibly despite being orphaned, which usually predicts bad things, who is just so socially gifted in touch, in reassurance, in creating friends from early on. It's one example, but again, it's relevant to your main point, but it's back to, rather than thinking about status as dominance, status is often coalitions, trust, and being generous. The males helping, and the males that play with babies. It's much more nuanced than what our stereotype can be. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Earned prestige versus socially dominant. Obama, Trump. No. Okay.
Absolutely amazing and paradigm shift. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the initiatives you're involved in? You just mentioned the one you just came from, and I think it would be exciting for people to hear about the level of movement in this area.
So two things. I think one is, and I didn't get a chance because I was running out of time, and I wanted to, sorry, it took a little longer to go through some of the pieces of this. But one thing that's exciting that is in the space of a Berkeley and UCSF collaboration, in addition to the pioneering work Steve has done, modeling this, is this computational precision health initiative that received a lot of funding, that Maya Peterson has been leading the Berkeley part, and this is really doing a lot of computational modeling. And and she's really interested, she and some of the people are really interested in this idea that to move from these general vague models of spiraling interactions, or what comes first, the rumination or the sleep disrupt, like thinking about modeling the developmental progression to mental health problems, not in a precision medicine traditional way, but that could be a really exciting opportunity, and to get interdisciplinary teams who are thinking across a lot of different levels. So I think, and Steve and I and when Matt, actually, we had a little conversation about this at one time. So I think that's one really interesting area. And then the second thing is that there are a couple well-funded networks that are recognizing that digital technology is the social domain where the action's happening. And there are thousands of apps and games and approaches to promote health, promote education, to do almost anything you would want to do. And what percentage of them have been evaluated in any sort of rigorous way? And what percentage of them have been designed thoughtfully for kids and adolescents? What percentage of them have been following beyond the initial engagement or user evaluation to what has a positive impact? And so there's been some big funding to say, okay, we need high integrity evaluation nodes who can give feedback to the entrepreneurial, incredibly creative people who are trying to have a positive impact, but get distorted by the profits and the wrong incentives that's driving a lot of this. And so I think that's a really exciting area, because I think there's, and actually the World Economic Forum has been part of thinking of this globally, how, as they're thinking about AI and increasingly AI everything, and digital technology and privacy and protection, but also to let kids have the positive side of this. So there's been the creation of approaches to evaluate what can have a positive impact. And what I like about this, and I think why, even though I'm not tech savvy, what I like about this is this idea, this framework fits that. We don't have to design something to treat a disorder. Yes, there's a lot of CBT online, but some of these principles can be to promote healthy development in thoughtful ways, and be evaluating things that are easier, and bring interdisciplinary teams together. So that network of researchers, which is global now, is trying to think about, not just technology for good, but how to create the right balance between protections for young people for the harms, but also evaluating what can be done. And then if it works, it can scale so quickly. And I think, everybody's been talking about this, but if we don't have a high rigor in the science, we know the high likelihood that it's going to get distorted fast. So. Thanks.
Anyone has questions? We said we have about 5 minutes of free time for lunch. So thank you for coming.